Good evening, everyone. I'd encourage you to get out your Bible tonight if you'd like to follow along. We're going to be picking up where we left off in Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. We left off in verse 19. I'm going to try and have slides this time. So this way, what we're going over will be up here, and it's just an easier way for you to keep track of where I'm at. So, if you get lost, it'll be up here. And so hopefully that'll help a little bit. So last week, we had started in on Job chapter 38, and this is where God began speaking to Job. And he was speaking out of the whirlwind, and right off the bat, God started asking Job all of these different questions. And he was asking them all of these different questions about creation and his works. And so he had asked Job quite a few questions, and he's kind of been asking them in sets. Each set of questions kind of has a theme. And so we've been going over that. And so we left off in verse 19. And so just as a reminder, as we're going through some good practices, is questions to ask ourselves as we're studying the Bible here. Who's speaking? What are they saying? Why are they saying it? And what's the application? And so that's something that we want to consider. And so God's third set of questions is where we left off. In Job chapter 38 and verse 19. So we'll read verses 19 to 20 here. It says, "Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place, that you would take it to its territory and discern the paths to its home?" So these are essentially the two questions that God asks in these verses here. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And where is darkness's place? And remember, he's asking this to Job, right? So first of all, do you think Job knows the answers to these? No, right? Do any of you have any idea of what those are? I certainly don't. I don't even know that I really understand what God's getting at with that. What does he mean? For me, when I think about the way to the dwelling of light, well, where's light come from? Well, I guess it comes from the sun and stars, and things like that. But what does he mean? Where's the dwelling of light? I don't really know. And when he made things in the beginning, he actually made light and darkness before he ever made the sun, right? Or the moon or the stars. So I have no idea where the home of light would be. Kim? Sure. And that might be what he's talking about, right? Yeah, he might be talking about heaven itself, if he's referring to himself as the light in that case. That's possible. I really don't know the answer to that one. Matt?
In the context of all of these natural things he seems to be talking about, I think it is like more night and day. How does night and day work?
Right.
And we might say, well, the Earth rotates in the sun,
right.
But we don't. It's not that we can control that or really see all of that happening. It's all behind the scenes. And maybe there's a spaceship that took a picture and we.
Yeah, exactly. We really don't know. We can try and give a scientific answer, but it's really just kind of grasping at straws here to answer God's questions. So really, the answer here is Job didn't know, and we don't know, right? All right, let's read the next verse. Verse 21, God says, "You know, for you were born then, and have the number, you know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great," right? So that's not really a question, but what's he saying to Job there? Someone maybe put that in modern day terms. Matt?
Is he being maybe a little sarcastic? Like, oh, you know all about this, Job, right? Because you were you were there when I created the earth, and you know how it works, right? No, you don't.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to read that in any tone but sarcastic. And it's kind of odd maybe to think of God as speaking in that tone, but just read that, and for you were born then. Well, clearly Job was not, right? And so, depending on the translation that you're using there, God is either asking a question, right? In the King James and the New King James Version, it poses that more as a question. I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, and so that one turns it into a statement, right? You know because you were born then. Whereas the other one's kind of, do you know since you were born then, And some versions, like the CSB, actually turns it into a question and a statement. So just depending on which Bible translation you're reading depends on whether God's making a statement or a question there. But really, the end result is that God's basically showing Job that he's really a small person, right? God is the Ancient of Days. It's not Job, the Ancient of Days, right? So, okay. Verse 22 to 23. Verse 22 says, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, and have you seen the storehouses of hail, which I have reserved for a time of distress, for a day of war and battle?" So those are the two questions. Have you entered the storehouses of snow, and have you seen the storehouses of hail? So I guess, first of all, what does God mean by storehouses of snow? That's not really a phrase that we would use today, right? So what is a storehouse of snow or a storehouse of hail? What is that? Matt?
It could be as simple as, do you know how that works? Do you know where that comes
Sure.
from? Because maybe the ancient idea was, well, it snows sometimes, so it's stored somewhere and then it comes out.
Right. So he could be asking how it works, right?
We know a little more about the weather, at least we think we do, but we still can't control it and really understand it.
Yeah. Addie, did you have your hand up? Okay. Anyone else have a thought on that one? I think he's right. I think that, the way that the ancient world talked about the natural world was a little bit different than the way that we might talk about it today. When just as an example, when you and I talk about elements in nature, we're thinking probably of like the periodic table, right? And when people talked about the elements way back in those times, they're thinking more of like earth and fire and water and air and things like that. They're thinking of it in a slightly different lens based on their understanding of the natural world at the time. And so this perhaps might have been a more relatable term for Job in where snow is stored or where hail is stored or how it even comes about. But Job didn't know the answer to that. We don't know the answer to that really, right? We haven't entered the storehouses of snow or seen the storehouses of hail. Maybe the most you could claim is that if you've flown on a plane, you've gone through a cloud at some point. That's probably the closest that any of us would ever come to that, right? Matt?
It's kind of interesting that he talks about reserving it for the day of war and battle.
Yeah.
We don't normally think.
So look who's jumping ahead, everybody.
Should I stop?
No, I'm sorry, I'm picking on you. Go ahead. That leads in perfectly with what we're talking about.
I was going to say, I don't normally think about that, but when you read that, I guess I think about, wasn't there hail in the plagues in Egypt?
Yeah.
And of course, Revelation, there's references to that. And wasn't there even something with his children? There was a storm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a storm. I can't remember if it talked about hail or not, but there was a storm with that. And that's exactly what I wanted to call out, was that God remarks that hail is stored up for a time of battle and war, right? And then I had asked the question, name a verse supporting this. Well, Matt just named a couple, and so here's a few that I thought up as well. Matt already named a few of these, but against Egypt, against the Canaanites, against Israel, against Gog and Magog, and then against a rebellious earth in Revelation chapter 16. Shirley?
My Bible has a reference to Psalms 135:7, and it says, He causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries. So this part references to God.
Mhm.
And I think those statements have a reference to God, because God is the only one that knows.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the, I guess, the key points and themes that God is making here is that Job, as a man, does not know these things, right? Obviously, the one who does know is God, who's the creator of these things. And I think I actually talk about that verse in Psalms a little bit later in connection with another verse. So we'll get to that again, but that's a good one because it does relate to the weather here. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or comments, or were there any other examples of hail that you wanted to call out? Okay. So then moving on, verse 24. Verse 24 says, "Where is the way that light is divided and the east wind scattered on the earth?" So that's another hard one for me to understand anyway. You know, when I think about light being divided, I think about, you know, a prism maybe, or perhaps how a rainbow is made. But again, I can't claim to know exactly what God's talking about there. Rick?
This might be a translation thing.
Mhm.
Mine says, in which direction is the lightning dispersed? Meaning lightning. And we know that lightning does look like light divided
That's
in
true.
the sky. So it could be referring to that. And then the other part mentions, the east wind being scattered. And, you know,
Yeah.
again, the meaning really, when we boil it down, is that God knows. I know.
Yeah.
But you don't know, do you?
Yeah, and that's really the key. That's really the key to a lot of these is maybe you have an inkling of how something works, but really it's not like you can give a full detailed answer the way that God can, right? The bottom line here is that God's knowledge is above man's knowledge, right? That's the key takeaway. Matt?
I think that east wind might represent like a scorching, a hot, dry
Oh, okay.
weather. Because you think about where Israel is situated.
Yeah.
They're on the Mediterranean Sea to their west. So the west wind would bring in moisture, and that would be the normal course of things. But it would be kind of like talk about a nor'easter, right? So it's
Right.
coming a certain way, it's going to be a certain storm. So if they had the east wind, that would represent to them the dry desert.
Oh, okay.
Air coming and destroying all their crops and stuff. And that's sort of contrasted with the water.
Yeah. No, that's a good call out. I hadn't thought about that. And so again, Job obviously did not know that because we don't have any verses here that says, and Job spoke up and answered God perfectly, right? So yeah, Job didn't know. We don't really know. And so really, just pause here for a moment. And from verse 19 to verse 24, how would you describe the theme of that set of questions? So all the questions that were asked in verse 19 to verse 24, what would you say the theme of that is? There's not really right or wrong answers to these questions.
I would say I created this. I made this, you know. So,
Yeah.
And you don't know how it happened.
Yeah. That's a good one. Anybody else have one?
In relation to the weather.
In relation to the weather? Matt?
I'd say broadly nature, but maybe
Yeah.
more specifically sky.
Yeah.
Things in the sky.
Yeah. And that was kind of my answer, was the nature of light, darkness in the sky. You can probably word it better than that, but that's what I came up with. All right, so the fourth set of questions, by the way, I'm dividing these up the way that I read it. It's, you know, this is really just one set of questions for Job. You could make the argument, but I'm just kind of dividing this up how I see maybe natural breaks along the way. So verse 25 here. Verse 25 to verse 27, it says, "Who has split open a channel for the flood and a way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on a land without people, on a desert without a person in it, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the seeds of grass to sprout. And so, who would that be? It's God, right? Yeah, it's
God.
certainly not Job, certainly not you and me. I think one of the interesting things about this verse is, you notice God asks this question, but then he adds a little bit more to it, right? And look at what he says. He's talking about the fact that he brings rain on a land without people, on a desert without a person in it. So God is making a point here that not only does he look after the affairs of people, but God is taking care of places where there aren't any people. God is overseeing his creation in other places. Mankind tends to think about everything as the world revolves around us, right? And God's saying there's a whole lot more world out there that doesn't have you in it, and I have my eye on that too. And so he's kind of making this point. It's not just about you, Job, and your life, but I also keep an eye on all of these things as well. So the next question, verse 28, he says, does the rain have a father, or who has fathered the drops of the dew? That's an interesting one. Does the rain have a father? How would you answer that?
Again, it would have to be God if there is. He's the creator.
Yeah, it'd have to be God, right? And that's kind of what I said. It's God, right? And so I looked at the verse in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 10. The beginning of that verse says, do we not all have one Father? Is it not one God who has created us? Right? So God is our Father because he is our creator. Right? And well, God created the rain as well. So if you were to say that the rain had any father, it would be God, right? Matt?
Or maybe in keeping with what you were pointing out in the previous verses, where even land where there isn't anybody,
Sure.
God just takes care of it. Like we would think maybe goats, there'd be a father, there'd be more goats. Well,
Yeah.
we see the water cycle, and it just keeps happening and happening, but there's no
Yeah.
father like that. It just
Yeah.
happens, and of course, the answer is ultimately God.
No, that's a good way to look at it too, is the fact that God has just set that system up to go, right? And so how he could be getting at how does that work, right? And speaking of the water cycle, I called out that if you remember just a few chapters ago, in chapters 36 and 37, Elihu spoke about the water cycle. And he did so that he could emphasize God's greatness in the way that he set that up, right? So, although we may not have liked Elihu's tone at all times, he did get some things correct, right? And he did speak some wisdom there, so the whole, a broken clock is right twice a day. So he did get some things right. All right, the next verse here, next couple questions, verse 29, kind of going along with that idea, it says, from whose womb has come the ice, and who has given birth to the frost of heaven? So again, we would probably answer that in a similar way as before, right? Either God, or perhaps God's intention here is to point out the fact that this cycle, this water cycle, is so well set up. And again, I just refer back to Malachi again. The one interesting thing that this brought to my mind, anyway, at least, was, Job's probably thinking of, when you go out and you see the frost on the plants and the grass and things like that. But when I heard frost of heaven, I thought about the fact that, if you're going up in an airplane and you go high enough, it gets frost on the plane, right? Because you go up high enough and that moisture freezes up there, right? And so that's quite literally frost in heaven. And so there's more meanings to that. And again, as our understanding of nature increases, as our science gets better, we just continue to reaffirm the things that God told us thousands of years ago, right? So all these things that we're seeing here, we just keep confirming, which I thought was neat. So the next question here. Oh, before we get to that, what was the theme of the fourth set of questions? So verse 25 to 30, what would you say is the theme there? What do they all have in common?
Well, that's all about water systems, really. Yeah.
Water systems, right? Yeah. The nature of rain and its effects, frost, snow, hail, things like that.
Perhaps a dumb question. What does your verse 30 say?
Let's see. Mine says, water becomes hard like stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned.
I didn't know if we had talked about that or if you had said that yet. So I wasn't sure.
No, I think I skipped over that verse. So what do you think that means?
Well, yeah, I think it has to do with being frozen, right? Because this translation says when the water becomes hard as stone and the surface of the deep is frozen, like we get on the Great Lakes sometimes.
Right.
Really thick ice. And
Right.
Poles and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely agree. Shirley?
And if you're in Alaska, when the water is frozen, you can drive a car on it, and they actually plow the ice.
Yeah.
So that's hard as stone,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it is frozen. Now,
Yeah.
there's a certain time you can't do that because in the summer you run boats on that water.
Right, of course. But yeah, I think that verse 30 is definitely talking about how ice works, right? Excuse me. All right, verse 31 says, can you tie up the chains of, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Pleiades, or untie the cords of Orion? Now that's an odd way to phrase that. So what do you think? Well, first of all, let's ask, what are the Pleiades? Stars, constellation, and Orion, constellation. Yeah. So then, what does that mean to say? Can you tie up the chains of the Pleiades, or can you tie up the chains of a constellation, or can you untie the cords of Orion? What would that mean?
Move the stars to change the shape? Is that what we're getting at, maybe?
Perhaps. Could you move the stars and change the shapes?
Yeah.
Right? Matt?
Or if you try to imagine the largest thing you can imagine, up the sky, and these things are so far away, it's like this largest thing. Of course, we can't even touch it, but God made all that. So God
Right.
can do all that.
Right. And I mean, perhaps this is a translation thing, but when it talks about the cords of Orion, we talk about Orion's belt, right? So perhaps that's what it's talking about there. You know, can you untie Orion's belt? Like, can you, to Rick's point, can you rearrange the stars? Can you move the stars the way that you want them to be? Well, no. Humankind can't do that, right? And so this is just illustrating the kind of power that God has to have power over the constellations, because, of course, he created them all, right? And where they are set, and where they move and how they move, that's all dictated by God, right? But, of course, Job can't control that, and neither can we. And I did, just for those of you who are curious, so I put this up here, and this is the constellation that we're talking about if you don't know what the Pleiades are. I think most people know what the Orion's constellation is, right? But the Pleiades, so here's Orion, here's Orion's belt, and if you look at like kind of where Orion's shooting, it almost looks like a tiny Big Dipper, and that's what the Pleiades is. So, you know, this is a pretty easy constellation for me to find because it's usually right over top of my house, and so I went out and I looked for that after I looked at this, and it was kind of hard to see. It's pretty dim, but using that as a guide, you can kind of see where it's at. So if you're curious, you can try that out at home.
And then in
Yeah.
Amos 5:8, it says he made the Pleiades and Orion.
Yeah, that's a good
So
verse to connect to
it's
that.
still
Yeah,
referring to God.
yeah, absolutely. Let's see. So this should be verse 32. So verse 32. Now, my version says, can you bring out a constellation in its season? Depending on what version you're using, if you are using the King James or the New King James, it'll say Mazzaroth, okay? Which seems to be the name of an ancient constellation, right? So not being able to pin it down exactly to which one that was, or at least I wasn't able to. Matt?
I looked it up, and this is the only place in the entire Bible that word is used. So it's a little confusing, but to give context, constellation seems like a good translation.
And I'm glad you pointed that out. One of the reasons that we do see differences in translation is because of context, right? You know, when I see a word I don't know, if I see that word used often enough in different situations, I can understand what it means, right? If you use a word that you don't recognize. But if you only heard that word said once, it's really hard to figure out exactly what it's meant to be, right? And so you have to use the best context that you can. And in context, it seems to be a constellation's name, or at least an ancient one. Kim?
My footnote says, can you bring forth the morning star in its time?
Okay, so that one's guessing the morning star, perhaps? Yeah.
And season or time.
Yeah. So again, this is all speaking to the power that God has over stars, right? And he goes on and he says, and guide the bear with her satellites. So we've been talking about stars. So I guess, first of all, any guesses as to what the bear is? Matt?
I think the Latin word for bear is Ursa.
Yeah.
Ursa Major. And
Yep.
so, and her cubs, or her satellites, her...
Yep. And that's what I thought too. I was thinking Ursa Major. I did see some other commentaries that said it could be a couple other things. So depending on who you're talking to, which scholar you're reading about, some people thought it meant Arcturus, Ursa Major, or even Ursa Minor. So either way, it's a constellation. My guess would be on Ursa Major, right? Because that makes sense with her satellites, with her cubs, right? But the bottom line is that it's talking about stars. It's talking about constellations and God having the power over these constellations. And again, if you ask, can you bring out a constellation? Can you guide a constellation across the sky? What's the answer? No. No. We don't have that power, right? All right. The next verse here. Whoops. Verse 33. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or do you establish their rule over the earth? So the way I understood that is that when they're saying ordinances of heaven, they're talking about the forces that govern the arrangement or the movement of the heavens, right? So what actually makes the stars move across the sky? What forces make that happen? That's what God's talking about. Do you know what those are, right? Do you control those? Do you even know what they are, Job? Well, our scientists are still trying to figure that out and understand that in great detail. So, of course, Job didn't know that either, right? Job did not know. And do you establish their rule over the earth, right? Again, these forces. Do you establish that? Do you know what they are? And then if you do know what they are, did you set them up? So, of course, the answer is no, right? No. Again, Job does not know or have that power over the heavens, and neither do we. And so, what do you think was the theme of this set of questions, 31 to 33?
Has to do with the stars and the constellations.
Stars, constellations,
The
yeah.
heavens.
Heavenly bodies, yeah. And again, we mentioned this last week, but if you go back and you look at Genesis chapter 1, a lot of these questions that God is asking, you find some insight to in the story of creation, right? You hear about God creating and making the stars and why he made them, right? For signs, for seasons. It talks about that in Genesis. So again, God seems to be kind of walking Job through that, albeit in a different manner, right? All right. the next set of questions. Verse 34. It says, can you raise your voice to the clouds so that an abundance of water will cover you? Again, I thought that this was an interesting one, the way it's worded. I don't think I would word it that way, but what do you think that that means, first of all?
I would think that it would be just God spoke and created the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So if he wants to tell the clouds to move from here over to there,
Right.
he's speaking.
And can we do that? Wouldn't that be nice?
No.
Wouldn't that be nice to say, I want to have a picnic today, so that cloud goes over there and these clouds stay over here? Wouldn't that be fantastic?
I think we would mess up everything.
I'm sure we would, right?
See,
Yeah.
this is the way I want it.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, back in those times, rain wasn't always seen as a bad thing, right? A lot of people in those times were farmers. Rain was important, and you needed that, right? Matt talked about the east wind coming, and that could dry things up. So you needed water. You wanted to be able to have an abundance of water when you needed it. And so God's asking, can you command that to happen? Well, no, you can't, right?
You hear people complain all the time. Every time it rains, listen to people complain about the rain. They don't know how blessed we are that we get rain.
Yeah, it puts a different light on saying it rains on the just and the unjust, right? It, we usually tend to think of that as a negative verse, right? Saying, good people and bad people get rain. Everybody has to deal with a punishment. And really, you could flip it around and look at that as it's a blessing. God blesses everybody. There are some blessings that are meant for all mankind, right?
That's how I've always taken it. I've always thought of that was meant as a blessing.
And I think that's the way I read it too.
But that's because you're looking back at their old agriculture. Yeah, for me, if I'm outside trying to do something, maybe I don't.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that there are some blessings that are for everybody. There are also some curses that are for everybody, right? Like mosquitoes, right? Nobody likes that. Yeah. Shirley?
Now, am I correct? It had rained on the earth until the flood.
That's the way I read it.
Yeah.
It was that dew rose up from the ground, and that's how the earth was watered. So until the flood happened, it had been watered differently.
Yeah.
That's the way I understand it.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have time for just one more, and then we'll be out of time for tonight. So verse 35 says, can you send flashes of lightning so that they may go and say to you, here we are? So send flashes of lightning. No, right? We can't control lightning that way, right? It's just fiction. Now this one, it's interesting because in a lot of pagan religions, right, that was the power of their ultimate god, right, was the ability to send lightning out. So think of Zeus, right, the Greek gods. What was Zeus's power? He had the thunderbolt. He had the lightning bolt, right? He was able to throw that down. If you think about the Norse gods, the Viking gods, right? What was their main god? Was Thor was their champion, and he was the god of thunder and lightning, right? So in many pagan religions, lightning was one of those ultimate powers. To be able to command that meant you had true authority over the heavens, right? And so God is showing that that's an authority that he has, that he can command lightning to go and it'll obey, right? It says that it'll go and say, here we are, right? You go there and say, yep, I'm there, right? And so that's one of the things that he was able to command. Matt.
Even in the Old Testament, the false god Baal. He was sort of the storm god. We even have statues where he has like lightning bolts.
Yeah.
And the whole situation on Mount Carmel with Elijah and the contest, and that they wanted fire to come down from heaven. And I think we probably should understand that as they wanted their lightning god to bring lightning.
Yeah.
And of course, then the true God did so much more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I didn't even think of Baal, but that's an excellent example. So yeah, perfect. Another example of how it fits in there. Any other thoughts or questions or comments for tonight before we wrap up? Shirley?
This is showing how great our God is.
Yeah. And that's, again, this is kind of the lesson that Job's being taught, right? I'm going to actually just briefly skip ahead here. And this is what we're going to talk about as the wrap up, but it's probably a good thing that we can end on tonight as well, is why God is asking these questions of Job. He asks an entire chapter of questions to Job about creation. And why did he do that? What was the point of all that? Well, the way that I read that is that there are two parts to it. One is it's as a reprimand, right? It's to remind Job that he is the creation while God is the creator. And part of this was because Job had, at the very end, demanded an answer to his situation. And Elihu was partly correct in that demanding an answer was really above Job's station to ask that, right? To ask a question is one thing. To demand it is different, right? So a reprimand was part of this. The second part was really as an education. It was a reteaching. You notice that all of God's questions refer back to his earliest works in Genesis. So it's almost like a back to the basics to Job. God had said that Job spoke without knowledge, without understanding. And so if you have no knowledge or understanding, you have to start back at the beginning, right? And so that's kind of what God is walking him through. So we'll pick up next week in verse 35. We'll finish up chapter 38 and we'll dive into chapter 39. And we'll continue in this similar style of reviewing God's questions and how they apply. So I appreciate the attention, everyone.
Before class, we sang 504, I want to be a worker. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, looking at the book of James for a couple minutes. We need to have a faith. We need to have a faith that works as well. And that's some of the things that James talks about. And if we look at James chapter 1, starting at verse 19, it says there, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all the filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And so I wrote some notes for myself. I wouldn't say this all to you this way, but these passages, I'll have it say to me this way, Matt, listen, shut up, and calm down. And so maybe we can get carried away. Maybe that's helpful advice for to think about it that way. Don't get worked up and be the one to say foolish things. Sometimes we just need to listen and hear the story and understand what's going on, and be careful not to just speak too soon. And maybe what's being said is making us upset. And maybe that's appropriate, but we still need to control ourselves and calm down. And it says there, the anger of God, or the anger of man doesn't lead to the righteousness of God. So we can get all worked up in our anger. And that is not a healthy thing to lead to good things in trying to follow God. We should have purity in our lives and latch on to, as it says, the implanted word. So the word of God, this book, but the implanted word, that book in our lives, being lived in our lives. And he goes on to say, but be doers of the word and not hearers only. That kind of goes back to the song. I want to be a worker for the Lord, not just a hearer only. Be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves for just thinking that's a good idea, saying yes, but don't actually act on it. We're deceiving ourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. So, think about real life. We have mirrors, right? And you're you got garbage all over your face or whatever, and you go, I got garbage on my face. Okay. And you walk away and you forget you didn't do anything about it. That's foolishness. We look at a mirror to comb our hair and get the garbage off our face or shave or, to fix it up. And as we think about that, looking into the Word of God, how does my life measure up to what God's calling me to do? And if we see something that's out of sorts, we don't say, amen, that's right, and then just walk away and not actually change anything in our life. We need to let the Word of God change us. Verse 25, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, the Word of God, and perseveres, sticks with it, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So when you look in that mirror, you fix it up, right? You make correction in your life. In verse 26, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, so he's back to what he started with, some of the, be slow to speak, right? He said earlier. But if we think we're religious but don't bridle our tongue, but deceive his heart, this person's religion is worthless. So we need to get things right in our life. And he goes on to say, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And so that's literally visiting people, but also helping people is what that means. Don't we just say to our brother, be warmed and filled, right? We help them. And to keep oneself unstained from the world, or unspotted from the world, that we would be pure. We would be good examples in the world. We would have looked into that perfect law of liberty, seen the things where we're falling short, and then work on that. Pray about that. Lean on our brothers and sisters to help us to make those things better in our life. To lean on God to help us get right with Him. So if there's anything you need to do in your life to get right with God, perhaps there's a certain extent to which we sometimes do look into that mirror and like that silly idea, see those things that are goofed up and then just ignore it. Maybe there's some time to make some change. Or certainly if you've never become a Christian, you need to make a change. You need to obey the gospel and be buried with Him in baptism. So the song we're going to sing, 284, what will your answer be? Someday you'll stand at the bar on high. That's not a drinking bar. That's the reference to the judgment seat. When a lawyer passes their bar exam, they're able to go up there and serve as a lawyer. So we're talking about a judgment scene. Someday you'll stand at the bar on high. Someday your record you'll see. Someday you'll answer the question of life. What will your answer be? So you can decide that today through obedience. We encourage you to come as we stand and sing the song.